Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Solutions Over Sweeps, How Homeless Policy Solutions Deepen Poverty. My name is Andy Coe. I'm Executive Director of Partnership for Safety and Justice. We are proud to be co-sponsoring this event with the ACLU of Oregon and the Coalition of Communities of Color. We're streaming live on YouTube, and this program is being recorded. We will place the link onto our social media sites, and that way you have an opportunity, if you know people who you think would be interested, you may share it with them after the event. Both ASL and Spanish language interpretation are available, and there'll be something in the links. There'll be links sent around. And before handing the program over to our outstanding moderator and panelists, a few words. Why this conversation? Why now? And why we care? We all know that this is a time of intense public anxiety and political divisiveness. It is a time when people seeking power historically have sought to weaponize our fears and escalate our anxiety. Too often, they are pursuing that power by attempting to turn us against the most vulnerable members of our society, including people experiencing homelessness. When they have succeeded, the result has always been racial oppression, attacks on civil liberties, and the use of the criminal justice system to spread injustice. That is why we care, and we are heartened to see that so many of you care as well. So now I'm very excited to turn this over to our moderator, Nicole Hayden, who's a reporter at the Oregonian, and our amazing panelists. Welcome.
Thanks, Andy. So I report on homelessness for the Oregonian. I've reported on the topic here in California and in Michigan. Today we're going to talk about, what kind of solutions and policies that are in place, worsen homelessness, such as arrests and sweeps, and how we can do better and look at the things we already do and what we hope we can do in the future. While I, in my reporting, often focus on, the worst end result for someone, which is, severe chronic homelessness, folks who have been unhoused for multiple years, who have dual diagnosis, such as mental health issues and substance use. There are lots of places within our system that can help someone far before they get to that spot. So we will talk about some of that too. So how this will work today is that we'll do the panel interview, and then there will be a Q&A section afterwards where I'll ask some of the questions you guys send in to our panel. And then we'll end with what you can do, how you can support meaningful solutions to homelessness. And so we encourage you while you're listening to drop questions in the Q&A box as they pop up, and those will be sent to me. So our panelists today include Mike Schmidt, our district attorney for Multnomah County. Before he was our DA, he served as the executive director of the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission. He was also a former high school teacher and a prosecutor before that. We also have Shannon Olive with us, the president and founder of Women First Transition and Referral Center, which is an organization that provides support to women so they can rebuild their lives through peer support, trainings, and other community supports. And then we also have Mercedes Elizalde, the public policy director at Central City Concern, one of our biggest housing providers in Portland. She collaborates with government agencies and community organizations to advance policy initiatives to support CCC's mission and housing overall. So we're going to start with a pretty broad question for each of you before we get into some of the deeper topics. So I was wondering if you could each just give us a quick sentence about what you think are some misconceptions about the overlap of homelessness and crime. Want to start with Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole, and thanks for having me today. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the overlap. I think of it as like the Venn diagram in people's minds of homelessness and crime. What I see as the biggest overlap is actually victimization, that people who are houseless and living on our streets are disproportionately the victims of crime and violent crime, especially. That's where we see a lot. Obviously, in any population, there are people that are engaged in crime. But people who are just living on the streets themselves that is not indicative of the fact that they are committing crimes other than what they're doing to try to survive. So I think we need to do our best to pull apart the issues, because the solutions are not at all the same.
Thank you. Mercedes?
Thank you. From where I stand in the community, I think one of the biggest misconceptions around crime and homelessness is that if you could like force somebody into some kind of rock bottom, like through the criminal justice system, that people will get better, right? If somebody has a substance use disorder or a mental health condition, if they're suffering from long-term poverty, that through some kind of course of punishment that people will get better. And it's just not the case. And in fact, when we criminalize folks, particularly for crimes of survival, things that are really connected to the reason someone is sleeping outside, we actually then make it harder for them to actually get to a place of stability. A criminal record is regularly used by the private market in housing and employment to deny people housing and employment. It's still a very legal and even encouraged form of discrimination, and it actually makes it harder for people to find stability.
Right. Mike, in what ways would you like to see the criminal justice system kind of disengage from the homeless?
Yeah. I think that we need to think about alternatives and how can we deflect people out of the system, because as Mercedes already pointed out, typically a barrier to a lot of the things that we all want to accomplish, which is to get people housed, healthy, and being able to thrive. So especially for low-level crimes that are considered crimes, like say, for example, a criminal trespass type of a charge. If we can actually deflect people out of the criminal system and into another program that exists that can get at the root causes of why that they're living on the streets, get connected to services, that would be a much more productive use of our time and resources. And we'd actually be closer to accomplishing what I think we all actually want to accomplish, which is to have a situation where the person is no longer having to live on the streets.
Thank you. So Mercedes or Shannon, I'm hoping you can kind of help us understand why it's important for us to kind of untangle the criminal justice system from housing. Can you talk about housing barriers people face more in depth? I know you mentioned it in the intro, Mercedes, but what are some barriers they face when they have criminal convictions or charges when they're trying to enter housing or get jobs or move forward with their lives?
Yes, thank you for that question. So as I mentioned, it's pretty common practice in the private market and even among some affordable housing providers to deny people housing anywhere between 5 and 7 years post their conviction or incarceration, right? And so it's essentially a mandated housing instability time unless you're lucky enough to have family with resources that can house you. Many people who've been through the system multiple times tend to not have those kinds of resources. And so we're really just creating a period of time where a lot of folks in our community are housing unstable. I think one of the things we should be looking for is how do we, instead of using somebody's engagement with the criminal legal system as a reason to deny housing, actually look at it as a reason to invest in that person's future. So Shannon, I think, can speak better to this, so I'll let her, but things like reentry programs where you're specifically pairing a housing intervention with folks who are coming out of incarceration, it's honestly the best way to reduce recidivism as well and make our communities much safer. So it's kind of counterintuitive. Like right now, our community seems to think if we screen people out, our communities will be safer, but really if we screen people in, our communities will be safer.
Yeah, so just to piggyback on what Mercedes saying, I think it is more important to better focus on the person versus the crime that they committed, because one thing that is very important with the work that we do here at Women's First is that we're looking to try to focus on giving a person a second chance, because again, once you continue to keep focus on the crime itself, it can become a trigger for a person because of the fact that we're looking at what they've done instead of who they are, and how can we work on helping bettering them and create a plan and put in place on what can we do to help them to provide whatever wraparound support services, and that can help them to become a better person and eliminate what barriers that are put in place to that's causing them to continue to go back to that old model behavior. Of course, society doesn't look at that. They continue to keep looking at what the cause or the charges that is causing them that stumbling block, and then that what's keep causing them to go back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth. But really continuing to help provide funding for services that can help the person to be able to get stable housing, get employment, get education, to be able to then have what is set in place for them to be able to be the best person that they can be, and be able to help them to advocate for themselves and their families, is what is really considered in when we're talking about not just housing first, but looking at people first.
Yes, thank you. Mercedes, you mentioned that it would be helpful if we connected some access to housing to folks when they exit the criminal justice system. Is that not how it's currently set up? Can you kind of explain to us what happens currently and what the system is like now?
Absolutely. So I would say first, we're a bit lucky in Multnomah County in that we have a county that has invested in housing resources specifically for folks who are being released from incarceration, but the state does not take responsibility for that. So it's county by county on whether or not there's going to be a housing resource or support for someone when they're being released. And even in that context, a lot of times our reentry programs are for folks who are being released from state prison into a county facility and then into community. So someone who, say, is being picked up for loitering charge after loitering charge, right? And they're just cycling through, they're not accessing that service. They're just cycling through. I think we see some really great work starting to emerge through Health Share, our coordinated care organization for our Medicaid benefit, who want to pair housing assistance with folks who are being released from incarceration, particularly folks who are on the Oregon Health Plan. So we know that they're already lower income and already trying to access healthcare services. And that's actually how we prevent more homelessness from happening, right? Sometimes we forget that homelessness doesn't just happen. It's a set of circumstances and a lack of resources that happen at the same time. And so if we were to take a housing resource like a housing voucher that helps someone actually pay for rent and pair that with folks who are at these kind of critical intervention points where they could be being released directly into homelessness, and instead help them to connect with a housing placement, we've eliminated somebody who would have showed up in our homeless information management system, right? We don't have to include somebody there. But oftentimes these resources are rationed, they're scarce, and we're not providing it for everybody. We're providing it for a select few people who happen to get lucky.
And if I can add something to that as well, Nicole, one of the things that I think that is very important now, that is, as I'm looking to see more organizations that, from what I'm hearing, just connecting with different agencies that I'm working with and just having conversations at the table, is that I think it really is important to meeting people where they're at inside of the walls. That's one of the work that we have been done since 2018, is going to Coffee Creek Correctional Facility and working with the women 6 months prior to their release. I think when the fact that they have someone that can make a connection with them prior to them getting out of prison, so that they can have a sense of direction before they're exiting, so that way, once you identify what resources and services that you are that you have prior to being released, that way you're not once you get out, you don't, you're just kind of like not knowing what the next steps are for you, but you have that sense of direction of where you're going to be going, where you're going to be placed, what resources that you are working with, who your service providers are, and you not only that, you have a peer mentor that's going to be there to support you, who's going to be there to advocate with you, that's going to be guiding you and helping you along the way to navigate back into society once you have been released. So it's less likely that homelessness is not going to be something that you have to worry about because you already have worked on a goal and an action plan prior to your release.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from both of you is just the importance of those supportive services, kind of paired with housing to help people make these transitions. Slightly different than exiting the criminal justice system, but when we talk about folks who are currently unsheltered and haven't accessed transitional housing or something like that, what's the importance of placing someone in housing before you start addressing other barriers like addiction or something like that? What kind of successes do we see when we provide housing first?
I'm happy to start there, because I think one of the things is really recognizing what it is that the individual person needs. Like we've had folks who said, I am ready for housing, but I would like to start detox first. And then we've had other folks who it's not even a thing on their list of things to do until they can have a couple of nights sleep, a regular shower, some regular food, and then they can start talking about what else they want to do with their lives, right? What we have seen in our internal data at Central City Concern is that for folks who access all three of our core services, that's housing, healthcare, and employment, they're about 7.5 times more likely to be stably housed 12 months later than folks who just got a housing resource or just got a healthcare resource or just got an employment resource, right? So when you combine those things, it makes people very successful. Now, the thing about housing first is that house keys end homelessness, right? That if you're trying to change someone's housing status, they need to be connected with housing. Everything else, as important as it is still everything else. Healthcare is not going to end somebody's experience of homelessness. It may help them on the way there, but it's the housing that ends their experience of homelessness. And so I think we need to really support folks in building those kind of individual plans that Shannon talked about. If somebody is looking for another kind of resource and housing, we should support them in that journey. If they're just looking for housing because we need to get them off the street because they're not going to be healthy and stable and well connected by just living on the street, then we should just get them into that housing. And then we can do the hard work of really disentangling what led you to experiencing homelessness in the first place. And it may have been 1 or 2 incidences in the last couple of years. It may be that this person has experienced housing instability since they were a child, and that has just been the reality of their world since they were young. But we won't know that until we take the time to get to know people.
I most definitely want to piggyback to that. I feel like it's very important. It's very important because, of course, you won't know who you're dealing with until you actually know who you're dealing with. It takes time. It takes time to gain trust. It takes time to build the relationship and make the connection. Everyone that comes to your door is not the same. So you have to sit down, you have to do an intake, you have to do an assessment to be able to know who they are. Like you said, somebody in our program, we have 3 different tracks that we work with. We work with reentry, treatment and recovery, and emergency housing. If it's someone like Mercedes says, it's somebody that's looking just to get into emergency housing, well, they still have to come to the program to be able to stay in our house for, a couple months until we can get them into emergency housing, into their housing. But at the same time, once they get into the housing, we still need to find out what was it that caused you to get evicted, or what was it that caused you to get out, what caused it that you lost your housing. So what do we need to do as an organization to help you to still obtain those skills and knowledge, and what we need to do to help you to get restored so that you don't lose the housing that you have now? It is very important that what we do here at our program is that we have a housing retention specialist who will follow up with them 6 months to a year to work with them, to continue to help them, to case manage them, so that they can be able to help address whatever issues and concerns that they have after they get into their housing, and then still work with the landlords and to ask any questions or address any issues or whatever over their overall tenancy, to ensure that they are utilizing whatever skills and services that we help provide them while they went through our program, just to prevent any eviction. Because the main goal is to help them to stay stabilized, right? The main goal is to keep them in their housing. The main goal is to help them to learn to advocate for themselves. The main goal is to provide them the techniques that they're going to need for their lifelong experience. So whether they're coming in from incarceration, whether they're coming in from treatment, whether they're coming in from a shelter, we want to ensure that we're providing them the wraparound support services to help them to stay permanent, get them the permanent housing, give them the stability that they need, give them the support that they need, but also give them the expertise and the tools and materials that they need so that they can be productive and successful citizens of our community.
Thank you. You both talked about the importance of kind of looking at what each individual needs. It's not a one size fits all. Can you talk about what happens when we don't provide culturally specific housing and supportive resources? And do we have a need for more of those organizations in our community?
So I think the biggest, oh, sorry. Did you want to start, Shannon?
Go ahead.
I think the biggest challenge is that we have like a series of services that are oftentimes disconnected, and that all are trying to ration help. And so although we know we need to be flexible and structure our services to meet people where they are, we actually oftentimes ask people to meet the program where the program is. And so we're not really in that space. What's great about culturally specific programs and culturally specific organizations is oftentimes you have people with so much lived experience who are leading that. And so not only do they understand how to navigate, the dominant system as it is, they also know how to extract from it the things that you need most. And it really helps people to see somebody who's like them, who's been there, who is ready to support them through this process without judgment, without preconceived notions about why that is that they need any kind of services, right? Not asking them to explain themselves, but really embedding it in community. And then the way services are delivered are also very different. Like if we look at the culture specific mental behavioral health programs that Central City Concern has, they provide services differently than our other substance use and mental health programs, because it's responsive to the way relationship building happens in different communities. And a lot of this is all a people business. This is all people work. And so when you empower communities to take care of themselves, invest in themselves, that's empowering, and it builds up a sense of community strength that you can't really just kind of like throw money at and expect to happen, right? It's something that happens because of that relationship building, because of folks who know what it's like and have been there before. I've seen a lot more organizations starting to build up their capacity over the last couple of years. And I think it's incredibly exciting because it really creates this sense of scale that we've been missing for a really long time.
Shannon, did you want to follow up?
What was the question again?
Provide culturally specific support and resources to folks.
I'm sorry, you froze it. What was it? I'm sorry, what did you say?
Yep. What happens when we don't provide culturally specific resources?
Okay. So when you don't provide culture-specific resources, then organizations like ours, Women's First, we end up not being able to help women that are help women like the women that mostly are impacted, that needs us. One of the things that what I have learned that over the years is that we and other organizations such as ours, we begin to become competitors against one another because of the fact that we are competing for money as it has always been. So we have the larger organizations who get the money all the time, and then you have the smaller organization or the culture-specific organizations who have to compete with one another because the larger organizations always get the money. But then when there's times for, you have the culture organizations who they every once in a while here's an award come out, we have to scramble or we have to compete with each other to try to go after the money. And it makes it hard for us. There's barriers that comes along with it. But at the same time, we are the ones that's on the ground running to doing the work for our people. And it just makes it, I don't know the word that I'm looking for, but it just makes it more challenging for us. So I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to pivot topics just a little bit now. So the title of this conversation is Solutions Over Sweeps, and talking about how some solutions we have in place might not be the most productive when addressing homelessness. And recently we've had mass solutions in Old Town, and the mayor has said there's more of that coming. So I was wondering if each of you or anyone, feel free to jump in, could address if sweeps are a viable solution, or if there are other instances where we think we're addressing homelessness in the best way, but we could do it better.
I'll jump in here. I think I don't think anybody thinks that sweeps are a viable solution. You talk to police officers, I talk to community members, I talk to business owners, I walk Old Town regularly. I don't think anybody thinks that sweeps are an effective solution to ending homelessness. And I think there's actually widespread recognition that, in fact, they're counterproductive if your goal is to decrease homelessness. So if that's what we're trying to accomplish, sweeps are clearly not the answer. So for me, obviously, what I think, I focus on the criminal lane. My job is not to solve homelessness. District attorney, criminal justice system is not the right tool if that's what we're trying to achieve. And we've already articulated, both Shannon and Mercedes have spoke eloquently about almost the irony that when people are excluded from housing, we actually become less safe as a community. So the criminal justice system isn't the right tool for the job. That being said, I think that there are some things a district attorney can do. And those things are what I've already touched on, increasing diversion opportunities. What Shannon has talked about really well, reentry, making sure that people have reentry plans, they know where they're going. Healthcare is continuous throughout, so that they're not having to figure out that. And then third, something that we've really focused on here at Multnomah DA is expunging old convictions. I just got off the phone this morning with the district attorney from Arizona, from Pima County, Arizona. And there's a man here in our community who's trying to access housing here in Multnomah County and would be eligible, but for an open warrant from a case from 2001 in Pima, Arizona. So because I'm the district attorney, I'm able to call my colleague in Arizona and say, hey, is this warrant really necessary? Is this something that you all are interested in continuing to prosecute? And of course, the answer is going to be no, because we're not talking about a homicide. We're talking about misdemeanor, low-level crime. Arizona has no interest in prosecuting that crime, but that warrant is preventing this individual from accessing housing services. So that's something that a prosecutor can do proactively, expunging old convictions, clearing out old warrants that are serving no public safety purpose, except for actually the opposite, keeping us less safe by keeping more people living on our streets.
I'll jump in. I think it's important to remember that like sweeps are a service for housed people. They are not a response to homelessness. They're not a service to people who experience homelessness. They are a service to housed people who call and complain about tents, right? And so I think, although I really appreciate DA Schmidt saying that a lot of people recognize that sweeps aren't a solution, they are for people who want tents to go away and aren't necessarily invested in the metric that matters. And the metric that matters is how many people are getting housed, right? And how are we decreasing the number of people experiencing homelessness? Outreach is something that has started to become like synonymous with sweeps and cleanups, which is really upsetting for me, because outreach is actually a service that is for people who are experiencing homelessness. But it takes time to build those relationships. And if we have our outreach workers having to, start building relationships with people only to have them displaced and then having to try to go find folks again to continue to build those relationships, we extend the period of time that someone is experiencing homelessness. We extend the period of time when we actually see real solutions. I think one of the most difficult things about our homeless response system is the way we ration services, the way we ration help. So if you think about something like food assistance is an entitlement program. If you qualify for it, you get it. The Oregon Health Plan. If you think about the Oregon Health Plan, it's also an entitlement. If you qualify, you get it. You get access to healthcare. But if you are experiencing homelessness and you need help with a housing resource, there are 0 housing resources that are available to people because you qualify. Right now, the best housing resource that we have, all the data shows that it works and that it improves not only people's immediate lives, but it improves long-term health and stability of communities, is the Housing Choice Voucher. The Housing Choice Voucher is available to 1 out of every 4 households that qualify. So if you, and in high-cost metro areas like Portland, it's closer to 1 out of 6 households that will actually get it. So we're taking the thing that actually makes the difference and we're withholding it from people. And that's the kind of policy decision that gets made year after year when Congress does not increase that budget, when they do not make that an entitlement. They make that choice every year. It's an active choice to not do that. They are perpetuating the great housing stability that we see and removing the resource that would actually make outreach most effective. And then we see that's when we perpetuate things like sweeps and like criminalization, because that's something that will happen in a matter of hours. Getting somebody into housing will happen in a matter of months. Getting a sweep done will happen in a matter of hours. And that's why we continue to see communities call for those and want those, even though they're not actually changing the realities in our community, and they can perpetuate the harm.
Thank you, Mercedes. Just want to jump in real quick and define what sweeps are if people don't know. So that's when the city forcibly removes tent encampments. They tell folks they have to move at least a few blocks away, and if they don't, then the city essentially throws everything away that they have. And we found from our reporting that even though the city says they do outreach prior to sweeps, that the majority of folks don't receive outreach or know how to access services, and that the outreach they do provide, if they are offered it, is mostly a shelter bed, and many folks don't feel safe going to mass shelters. And there's no data yet that shows that people who have experienced a sweep have been connected to long-term housing or mental health services or things like that. Just wanted to add those details in before we move into some listener questions, because it looks like we do have some questions from folks about sweeps. So thanks to our panel for all the information you provided so far. I'm going to ask some of these questions that have been submitted, and feel free to jump in if you want to answer them. So this first one says, I understand that sweeps can feel harmful and it disrupts people from being stable and getting housed, but sometimes homeless communities can feel scary or threatening. What other options are there to help our neighborhood feel safe? I'd also like to add to that, can we address the portion where communities can feel scary or threatening, since that also seems to be a misconception of homeless communities.
Well, I just want to jump in and say that, you know, I most definitely do a lot of driving around different campsites, and just because I'm a person that likes to serve, and so I go to some of the campsites and just pass out socks, and I give out food and different things to the different people. When you talk about the sweeps, I've talked to a couple people in the housing departments and stuff, and read a lot of the Mercury Weeks and different articles and stuff. One of the things that I truly feel is because I feel like there's a lot of people that have authority. You have the county, you have the city, you have all the people that have authority and who make decisions on what happens in our city, our county, our state. And one of the things that I truly feel like there's some people outside that lives on the streets who doesn't mind staying out there. And like Mercedes was saying, housing, it takes a couple months for people to get housed. It takes for a sweep just a day to go out there and do that. So one of the things I feel that the people that make decisions over what happens in our state, county, city, I truly feel that if there is going to be people that are living outside, because they find places to go. They stand on the highways, off the highways. They're staying on the sidewalks. They're staying in all little areas where they can find to be able to sleep. So my thing is, if they're finding places, the city should be able to find a little, like the Right to Dream has found downtown off of 4th and Burnside. They found that big old lot where the owner was able to let them stay there for a certain particular time, but then they end up moving them over by the convention center, and now they actually run that space and have that whole lot out for themselves. So my thing is that if you have elected officials, as county commissioners, you have the state legislators, it should be that we have a whole bunch of abandoned lots where they can be able to have people that stand outside until they can get housed, that they have these places, they have little tents out there, and they have the people themselves that are running the spaces. People go by, they put the dumpsters, they put the sharp containers, they put all these different things. People come by, give them food. They run the spaces so that these areas and different areas, you have different neighborhoods all over the city of Portland where people are staying at until they can get housed. You have mental health therapists, you have peer mentors, you have housing specialists, you have these different providers that are coming to these campsites that are working with them until they get into their houses. So by the time they get into the houses, they are having those support services prior to them. So when they get into the houses, they got the support services that they need. So when they get into the houses, they already have those services so that they can continue on working to become stabilized mentally, physically, emotionally, and whatever else that they need, so that they can be able to housing first, but they have the support services. And then now once they get in there, they can start looking for their work. Some of them can even be working while they're outside staying at those tents. But I feel that there's a lot of power that can be done while they're staying on the streets. Prior to them getting into the house. If they can do a sweep and come out and sweep up the space and put them wherever they're going to put them and take all the stuff, they can also do the power of getting them into a camping site, bringing those people out to do outreach and making the places clean and having them people into these spaces where they can be able to be stabilized while they're living on the streets. I really believe that. We have the power to do other things. They can have the power to be able to have the people staying at a campsite and cleaning up the streets, but having more structure and stability while they're living on the streets.
Thank you, Shannon. Yeah, one thing you touched on is making encampments livable where they are instead of sweeping them. So that can look like increased trash services, hygiene services, shower services, the things house people get. Like we get our trash picked up every week. So I don't have trash piling up in my apartment, but if I didn't have that service, it probably would pile up. And so we do have limited trash pickup to encampments, but many folks have told me that it's not reliable. They put their trash out to be picked up at the designated sites that city workers say they'll pick them up, but then that trash isn't picked up. So there are solutions that we can, address without moving people. And also, before we go to another question, the part of the question about homeless communities feeling scary or threatening, I think perhaps Mike was or I'm remembering it wrong perhaps, but at the start of this, it was mentioned that folks who are homeless are often the victims, not the doers of crime. And I think you start learning that as you interact with unhoused neighbors, and there are ways that if you're housed, you can do that might feel comfortable to you. I know the Downtown Neighborhood Association has a homeless committee, and they take turns walking the streets, providing simple survival things like food, blankets, gloves, socks, things like that. And then you get to know folks and realize that it's not scary or threatening to walk by someone's tent. Before we move on to our next question, did anyone else want to address this question?
I just wanted to add that, I think it's important for folks to remember that people don't choose to be homeless, but people do choose to have choices. People choose to make good out of a bad situation. People choose to continue to live regardless of what, they might be missing. And so if you're seeing folks and you're wondering, I think it's understandable to be afraid of things you don't understand. And so to Nicole, to your point, like the way communities have started to organize around getting to know their neighbors really decreases that fear. I think the other piece of it is around how do we have some patience. What Shannon is describing is like is an outreach opportunity, right? So instead of looking at calling to complain, to get something out of sight, out of mind, instead of thinking about how do we use those as engagement opportunities that mean that tent or that group of tents might remain there for a couple of weeks, maybe even a couple of months. We talk about navigation team a lot, and I think it's important for folks to know that when that model stood up in San Francisco many years ago, the navigation team was meant to have dedicated shelter beds that only they could fill, and that they were supposed to have anywhere between 2 weeks and 2 months to engage with people. Now we're doing outreach like a stopwatch, right? And so people are saying they're not getting any outreach or they're not getting connected. It's because it's happening under such a pressure cooker of time that it's just not realistic. So if you want to see your community, feel better, feel safer, and those folks who are experiencing homelessness actually get something beneficial out of it, it also means that it's going to need to take time. The more time you give it, the better results we'll have. The faster you want something to just be gone, the more likely it will cause trauma.
Thank you, Mercedes. Another question is that gun violence appears to disproportionately impact people who are experiencing homelessness. How do we reconcile this with teasing out the various reasons people are homeless? I guess maybe Mike, could you comment on, is gun violence disproportionately being seen in homeless encampments compared to the larger community? And if so, how do we keep folks who are homeless safe?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I really appreciate the question because I think that frequently people don't really recognize that our most vulnerable population is our unhoused population. When you think about the percentage of our population that they make, I saw the last point in time count was over 5,000. Obviously, it's probably more than that, but that's, if you use that as a number, the rate per capita of people being shot by guns is exponentially higher than any other population in our community. So they are our most vulnerable population. How do you work on those things? Well, I think, there are a bunch of different roles, and I really appreciate what Mercedes and Shannon were saying about individualized, meeting people individually, because there is not a one size fits all. Law enforcement has a role in terms of, when somebody shoots somebody, to investigate and to hold the shooter accountable for their actions and remove them for the situation. This is really challenging for a lot of reasons. One, a lot of folks who are living on the streets do not have trusting or good relationships with law enforcement based on previous experience and history. They are not very, a lot of times they're fearful of being witnesses, fearful of cooperation, both fearful from what the reprisal may be because of on the streets, but also fearful because they don't trust law enforcement. That makes those cases incredibly hard for us to make if we don't have witnesses that can help us, prosecute and make arrests. So we need to work on, law enforcement needs to work on, building relationships, being there for people. I think the HOPE team that the sheriff has is a good example of, going out there and doing what Shannon does, which is handing out socks and building relationships, and then, having something to actually work with in terms of building that trust, that foundation. But it's absolutely, that's our lane. That's the law enforcement lane. There's a lot more lanes there to help get guns off our streets and to help people get helped in terms of not getting shot. So I think the law enforcement is that we need to build better relationships, work on trusting relationships, and that way we can do our job. But there's a lot more to it that I'm sure Shannon and Mercedes can talk more about.
Unless Mercedes or Shannon have any last comments they want to add. No, we will start wrapping up. We have so many questions, so thanks to everyone for being incredibly engaged, and we can't get to them all, but feel free to, you can email me, email Talia, and we can try to get your questions answered offline. But we want to save the last few minutes to let you know how you can get engaged in your community and support your neighbors. So thank you, Mike, Shannon, and Mercedes, for your time and all the information you shared. And I will, pass it back over to Marcus Mundy.
All right, I hope you can hear me. It's an interesting screen in front of me, but I am Marcus Mundy. I'm with the Coalition of Communities of Color, and I get to wrap up. I have an easy job because I'm here to kind of remind you what you can do. You've heard most of it from Mercedes and Shannon and Mike. You've heard several useful pathways for addressing some of the issues. It's not a panacea. It's not all the answers, but those are good, stable, considerate things about what you can do. So yeah, next slide, please. So, the actions I wanted to share with you are things you already know. You can urge your local officials to support the real housing solutions, many of which you've heard today. You can urge them, deceptive ads don't end homelessness, sweeps don't end homelessness, housing ends homelessness. You've heard that from both Shannon and Mercedes and Mike. We did approve in 20 as a region, all three counties, Clark County, Washington County, and Multnomah County, funding for housing services with the Metro Housing Bond. That was an incredible amount of money and support to address some of these issues, both structural issues, service issues, housing placement. There's a lot of dollars in there, and you can help make sure that your local officials are making sure the dollars are being used properly for that. political power players like People for Portland, they're spreading lies and disinformation about the success of the efforts that are already underway. And they're doing it to sabotage progress. They want to warehouse people in shelters. That is not the answer. You've heard that from all three of the professionals that spoke before me. Those aren't the answers. The answers are to urge your local elected officials in Portland, Salem, Bend, all around the state to stay on track with the real housing approaches that we know work. Just in our region alone, there's the Joint Office for Homeless Services, the Portland Housing Bureau, the County Housing Services, Metro. You have people you can go to talk about housing solutions, and that, again, some of the levers that they talked about, Mike on criminal justice, Mercedes and Shannon on the actual housing things, those are the places you can go to begin to get some of your questions answered. And you do have to take action. I mean, we're at action number 1, but these actions will drive us forward. Could you maybe go to the next slide? Number 2, advocate for a more, and by the way, we might have 3 actions today. There's 5,000 actions you can take, but the number 2 action we're talking about is advocate for a more effective form of government in Portland. Portland has a chance to improve its form of government. You have a chance to, and we're not just talking about Portland in this conversation, but it is kind of a regional conversation. Portland has a chance to increase its city council to 12, to adopt ranked choice voting, to elect city leaders by geographic districts, and to shift the management of city services from elected leaders to a city manager. That, all that might be some political jargon, but what it really is an opportunity for a little bit more focus on districts and have more responsiveness for your elected leaders when it comes to all issues, but in the case of today's conversation, when it comes to housing. These reforms, it'll make the government more streamlined and efficient. Well, just what I said, while increasing responsiveness to our everyday needs and concerns. And it'll make it somewhat easier to address housing and homelessness. I urge you, I am with the Coalition of Communities of Color, but I urge you to join our Charter Review action list to learn about opportunities to support improving Portland's charter. So you see the link on this slide, but anybody who's on this call will get emailed all the calls and the links to this video and the links to the context for the different actions. So don't worry about writing it down. You'll be forwarded this information. But this is critical, that we need all of you residents of this region to focus on advocating for a more effective form of government in Portland. And I know when I'm talking about Portland, I'm only talking about one city in our region, but it is the biggest city. It is the biggest driver of revenue and policy. And so if you engage in Portland and you engage in Multnomah County, where DA Schmidt works, we can drive change. The other counties are just as important, Washington and Clackamas, but if you focus on these 3 counties, we can make some change. The next slide. The last action is just, and I think the next slide is 2 slides. It's staying in touch. There are questions that each one of these groups that you see listed here, and then the following 3 can provide you. Not all of us can answer every question, but I guarantee you, if you reach out to one of us, we will put you in touch with the other one of us who can more appropriately answer your question if we're not the right source. These groups are focused on getting you the information you need so you can be better residents, better citizens, better advocates. And if you're unhoused, to get housing. If you're housed, to get services. So I encourage you to reach out to all the people that you heard from today. And more importantly, as importantly, reach out to your elected officials. DA Schmidt is elected, but there are a host of elected officials that can drive this train for you, and we can make some progress on this. I will say, and I'll wrap up now, and before I pass it back to Nicole, but if you've registered for today's webinar, we will follow up with resources, video recording of today, other useful information for how you can advocate for policies and programs and funding that reduce barriers to housing and get keys into the hands of people experiencing homelessness. As Mercedes and Shannon said, you know, housing ends homelessness. Everything else is just a Band-Aid. So on behalf of everybody on this call, the great advocates you heard from Central City Concern, Rebuild Women First, the Multnomah County DNA, and then Partnership for Safety and Justice, the ACLU of Oregon, and the Coalition. Thank you for joining us, watching, asking questions. I believe any questions that remain unanswered in the chat or in the questions box that they will try to answer on the final push out of the information. And again, just thank you, everybody. Goodbye, but I will pass it back to Nicole just in case there's anything else. And if not, then we'll be done.
Nope, that's all. Thank you so much, Marcus, for sharing that information for us. Thanks everyone for coming, and have a great week.
Thanks.
Mhm.